Hi everyone, give me just a minute as I get my Zoom set up here. Okay, is that working? Can you see the screen? I lost my Zoom uh, presentation window, but that's all right. Okay, so I wanted to begin today, um, first of all, by thanking everyone for being here and for thanking Vincent for organizing and my fellow panelists, both today and the other weeks of this series, and to the Center for Peace and Conflict Studies for hosting this series. And I want to start off by saying that I'm speaking to you from over a month into this war from a place of profound personal and professional heartbreak. Second, I'll frame these comments by saying that I'm speaking to you today drawing on my experience as an anthropologist who has done research on aging in Poland since 2006. I'm not an expert on Ukraine, but I do know from my own research in Poland about the devastating and long-lasting consequences of war and the shocking yet horrifyingly all too familiar nature of this particular war, of Putin's war for people in Eastern Europe. So this is the overview of the presentation I'll be giving today. First, I'll talk through some basic fundamentals of an anthropological perspective on war. Next, I'll share some stories from Ukraine, Poland, and the region. I'll pose some broader questions to keep in mind in the time moving forward, and then I'll share just a few resources to learn more about the war and what's happening, as well as opportunities to help. So here are a few key points about anthropological perspectives on war. So first of all, and this is essential to understand, war is not innate to the human species. It arises under particular political, economic, and sociocultural conditions. We know this from both the archaeological and ethnographic record. This perspective is vital to countering the reductionist views on human nature that can dominate in some intellectual domains and in the public sphere. War is not innate to the human species. This perspective is fundamental in working towards peace. Second, violence and war are not innate features of multicultural societies. People of multiple ethnicities, religions, and languages can coexist in a single political formation. This perspective is fundamental in working towards peace. Third, experiences and effects of war are heterogeneous. In other words, there's variety of experiences. Not everyone is experiencing the same thing. This is pretty obvious, but it's important to point out because then it's a place from which we can ask questions about the varieties of experience. One obvious way to think about this in Ukraine right now is along the categories of gender and age. So men ages 18 to 60 are not allowed to leave, meaning that men and women, people under 18 and over 60, are having different everyday experiences and possibilities in lives. These are structuring forces that are reshaping lives and futures. And of course, there's many more examples of this heterogeneity of economic status, of race, ethnicity, occupation, place of residence, health status, social networks. So it's important to ask questions about this range of experiences. Fourth, people's lives and social relations are being fundamentally transformed in this moment. Essential features of what it is to be a person in the world, the relationship between person and society, are being transformed. The legacies of this are generational in scale, and we must be prepared to think and act, both in terms of immediate crisis and long-term consequences. And finally, we must think about war holistically. This means we can think about the health impacts, the loss of cultural heritage, kinship relations, economics, political life, religious life, institutions of higher education. This war means devastation and transformation on a holistic scale, and all elements of this deserve our consideration and attention. So now I'll share just a few of the many kinds of experience, a few of the many experiences that are happening right now in Ukraine, Poland, and the region. I want to highlight in talking about Ukraine and talking about the stories of two kinds of persons about whom we hear less often, older adults and persons with disabilities. So first, both groups are much more likely to stay than other portions of society and can be particularly vulnerable to violence, in some cases dramatically so. There's reports of a nursing home in Ukraine that was bombed, of Russian soldiers raping older women. People with disabilities are stuck in place for mobility issues. People with health needs who need certain types of medical equipment and medication, their lives are all particularly threatened by this war. Mobility, sensory, cognitive impairments pose extra challenges to life in a city that's being bombarded. But I also want to report stories of the actions and agency of older adults and people with disabilities. In one story recounted by a Ukrainian sociologist in Kiev during the first couple of weeks of the war, she was talking about older women in her large apartment block who were leaving food outside their neighbors' doors. They were leaving potatoes, loaves of bread that they had baked, jars of tomatoes that they had prepared. They were providing care for their neighbors. Similarly, disability rights activists, including people with disabilities themselves, are continuing to activate their social networks and provide food and support and solidarity for their friends and colleagues. The anthropologist Sarah Phillips has shared stories of one of her colleagues in Ukraine, a man with mobility impairments in a wheelchair who's organizing food and drink for neighbors in the basement of the hotel where they're sheltering in Kiev. And other disability activists are mobilizing efforts to evacuate their friends and colleagues. And I share these stories because it's important to note that older adults, people with disabilities are not only passive victims and vulnerable. They are particularly vulnerable, it is true, but this is not the only framework through which to view them. And keeping this in mind is essential to maintaining the humanity of people in this incredibly dehumanizing experience. I was fortunate to attend a webinar earlier this week, one of the many like this that are happening right now. This one was hosted by the University of Alberta in Canada, and the anthropologist Yulia Boyskik at the Center for Applied Anthropology in Kyiv was sharing her own experiences, was talking about fleeing her own apartment in Kyiv for her mother's apartment, which was on a lower floor of a building. So she stayed there for a while. They slept in the corridor for safety. And her grandmother, her mom's mom, had passed away in December 21, so just a few months ago. And her grandmother had survived the Nazi occupation of Kiev. And because of her grandmother's wartime experiences, she saved and preserved food throughout her whole life in response to her own war experiences as a child. So Julia and her mom in early March were eating from the actual food that her grandmother had saved as the result of her own war experiences. So these histories and strategies of endurance have material relevance in the present. To share a few of the many stories from Poland. So it's not an exaggeration to say that Polish society has transformed in the last month to becoming a refugee support society. With over 2 million refugees from Ukraine now in Poland, the response is overwhelmingly supported by Poles. Everyday people are reorienting their lives to house, feed, and otherwise support refugees. There are so many stories I could tell here. I'll share just a few. On the second day of the war, the husband of one of my friends drove from Poznan in Western Poland to a town southeast of Lviv to pick up children whose mother was living and working in Poland, but whose father couldn't leave Ukraine. And so my friend's husband drove to pick them up and bring them to Poland to reunite with their mom. And he actually took a van and came back with a car full of 9 people, women and children, and a dog and a hamster. It took them 2 days to cross the border, and my friends are now helping them find places to stay and work and go to school in Poznan. One of the places where I did research in Poland, a day center for people with Alzheimer's disease, is now housing families of refugees, helping them find work and helping the kids continue schooling. And my friend and colleague who leads the center keeps saying, "We're all in solidarity. Solidarity is beautiful." An NGO in the city of Wrocław is now a food pantry. It's turned into an everything pantry, actually. People are, in addition to processing tons of donations from German and Dutch companies that they're receiving, people in Wrocław, in the Polish city of Wrocław, are baking cakes, bringing jars of homemade soup that you see here. I'm on many Facebook groups with people offering apartments, places to stay, Polish people offering places to stay, Ukrainian refugees looking for places to stay. In addition to these kinds of kind of housing partnerships that are happening online and match boards, Ukrainian refugees are also offering their services in their profession. So I've seen people who are bakers, portrait artists, massage therapists offering to work and looking for opportunities to continue their own ways of life in this new context of radical disruption. And truly, the incredible range of human creativity and energy and will to live and thrive is just staggering and overwhelming to see. I'd like to share now a story from my own research, which relates to the current war, which highlights the echoes of the past and helps us to think about what may come next and the generational stakes of the war. And I tell part of this story in my book on the topic of aging in Poland. So there was an older man who lived in the city of Wrocław in southwestern Poland, who was a retired doctor. He was born in 1927 in Vilnius. And he was exiled in Siberia for 6.5 years with his mother and sister. His father was killed in Katyn by the Soviets. His great-grandfather was also deported to Siberia for participating in an uprising in 1863 against the Russian Tsar. There's so much to say about this incredibly vibrant person, but I'll note here that his exile in Siberia shaped his whole life. His wartime refugee life in his teenage years profoundly shaped his adulthood. He was distrustful of Polish colleagues. He did not make friends. He was cautious and wary. He called himself a loner and said he never had a true friend because the fear that he experienced living under Soviet rule in Siberia shaped his whole life. And of course, this is one story, and there are, of course, personal effects to this too. Everyone is an individual and personality matters and all of these things. But I think it's important here to highlight the lifetime effects of the experiences of what's happening now and how these can transform not just people's material resources and possibility and life chances, which it certainly does, but it also affects how people come to relate to each other. And I think that attention to this kind of level of intimate social relation is essential for understanding the effects of this war. And, there's millions of such stories in the region. Friends and colleagues, especially in Lithuania and Latvia, have been sharing similar experiences. The echoes of the past are no longer past. There's kind of a time warping that's happening in this moment now, which is part of the profound sense of fear that people in the region are experiencing at the moment. So I'll ask some questions now that come from this line of thinking that I'm going to be thinking about going forward, and I'd like to encourage us to, as global citizens, to be thinking about in the context of this war. So what does it mean to live within wartime identity categories, such as gender, age, or disability status? So which aspects of personhood and social relations come to the fore and which recede? What does it mean to live in a society in which your identity as a man aged 35 all of a sudden is the most salient feature about you? Other aspects, such as being an artist, a father, a friend, an employee, the jokester in your family, don't matter at that moment. You're reduced to a certain category. And that is kind of the main structuring force. What are the effects of this? How does that shape the kinds of social relations that are possible? What kinds of sociality, solidarity, and care become possible in this moment? And what are their histories and futures? How is it possible? What explains the massive support for Ukrainian refugees in Poland? The shared history is essential to understanding this. And that partially explains the differences between the contemporary support for Ukrainian refugees versus the other support for different refugees in recent times. Although I would also note on that comment, I see a question on the chat here that it's important to distinguish between the responses of states and citizens here. But in any case, how is it possible that people suddenly open their homes to complete strangers on, and sometimes 15 minutes notice? What makes that possible? What kinds of futures does that make possible? How do people create continuity amidst rupture? And which kinds of ruptures and losses can be overcome and transformed? How and which cannot? And what are the effects of these losses? I'll close here with just some resources for more information and some opportunities among the many here to help. So, and surely some of you attending already know this, but the Kyiv Independent is an excellent English language source for news from Ukraine. There are many academic centers in the US, but not only, who are hosting many panels like this. The three listed here are particularly active. I also recommend following Ukrainian scholars on Twitter. There's a lot of great information coming there and perspectives. And then there's a few organizations that are helping on the ground in Ukraine and Poland. Some ones that I know of that might not be getting as much attention are Fight for Right, which is a disability rights organization in Ukraine, which is helping to evacuate people. As well as Sector 3 in the city of Wrocław, which is the kind of food and everything pantry I mentioned, as well as Migrant Info Point in Poznan, which is a long existing organization to help migrants in the city. All of those places are both good sources of information as well as are accepting donations for people who are looking to contribute in that way. And so I think I'll end my presentation there, and I'll look forward to my colleagues' presentations and comments. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was really thought-provoking, and I think those questions that you had at the end there are definitely ones that we all need to be keeping in mind because I think they're very sort of productive kinds of questions. And also, thank you for putting up those resources. I think those are going to be very helpful for a lot of people. I want to then just pass the baton to Dr. Brad Roth, who will be our next presenter.
Okay, thank you very much. And I would like to be able to say it was a pleasure to be here. It's certainly an honor to be, but it's very unfortunate that we have to be having this kind of conversation. Jessica's presentation is a hard act to follow in that it really points up many of the really crucial human aspects of all of what's being confronted right now in Ukraine and in the immediate surrounding areas to which people have fled. So I am going to speak at a rather higher level of abstraction. I think that there's some reason to do so, precisely because many people look at the situation from a great distance and question perhaps why we should be as fixated on this as indeed we are. And I want to speak to issues of international law here and point out the ways in which this is a truly distinctive breach of the international legal order, and one that should concern us very gravely, not just with respect to the human consequences on the ground, as severe as they are, but because of what they mean for something even larger in terms of potential human costs, which always are entailed by these kinds of breaches in the international order. So the first thing I want to say is that this is not a close case from the standpoint of international law. In a way, it's to talk about the details of how this violates international law is itself kind of a distraction from what we really need to be focusing on, which is that this is an attack on the international legal order as such. And the reason why I say this is because what you typically have when states use force to violate international law, and I'll talk a little bit about the framework of the use of force in international law in a bit, but usually what you have when states violate the norms of the international use of force is an effort on the part of those states to sort of give a legal rationale or legal sounding rationale that communicates the idea that even if the claim is not accepted as valid international law, that we are all in some sense playing the same game here, that there's a certain set of expectations about the behavior of international actors that remain in place, that there's no reason to think that everything is up for grabs just because this breach has occurred, or to imagine that this one act is going to augur other acts that will totally upend our set of expectations about how powers act in the world and what restrains powers from using whatever force they can, vis-a-vis whatever legal barrier there may be. Generally speaking, you get either a tendentious, but in some way vaguely plausible interpretation of the facts put out by a state that's engaging in this sort of act, or a characterization of the law that changes the balance of how international law treats various considerations that it nonetheless acknowledges as having a certain kind of validity and significance. And so a lot of the kinds of argumentation that you saw, for example, in 2014, vis-a-vis the areas of the Donbass that we'll talk about in a bit, and Crimea, could be discussed by reference to international legal categories that people understood, even though there was really no defense of the actions on the part of the Russian Federation at that time that was cognizable in international law. Still in all, the kinds of claims that were being made were consistent with a certain set of expectations about the kinds of things that states say and do with respect to existing norms. This is fundamentally different. This is a fundamental attack on the Ukraine's statehood as such, on principles of sovereignty as understood in the international legal order, and really sort of open the door to the potential for any kind of use of force across borders. We often, there's a tendency to imagine that international law is kind of pie in the sky, that it represents a kind of utopianism, that the sort of parchment barriers, one might say, to exercises of hard power. But the reality of it is that the basics of international legal norms have so seeped into people's consciousness about the range of possible actions that generally speaking, states don't even think of as being on the table options to commit certain kinds of acts. The certain kinds of activity that states could easily be imagined to undertake if hard power were all that were at stake. You would, it seems like all sorts of reasons to violate things like a diplomatic immunity and the inviolability of embassies and all sorts of things. It turns out that states almost never even consider violating these norms because they are so deeply entrenched that the way states understand their interest and understand their range of actions is structured in accordance with a shared understanding that this is what it means to be a state in an international order to act within certain kinds of constraints. So we sometimes say that the rules of the international legal order have a constitutive aspect, that they actually create in important ways the range of activities of states and the ways in which states conceptualize their interests. But it's of course also important to recognize that those international legal rules are never fully constitutive of that reality. That one can use the analogy that's sometimes given to the rules of chess. The core rules of chess are rules that are fully constitutive because states cannot because if you're engaged in a game of chess, if you violate the core rules of chess, it's not that you're no longer playing chess anymore, it's that you're no longer doing anything anymore. That what you're doing is actually nonsense, given that there's no object to it other than understood within the rules of the game. That obviously is not the case internationally, that states can indeed take advantage of violating international legal rules. And of course, there is not only some advantage to be derived, but also great destruction to be wrought in breaching of those rules. So we have to think about these things in a nuanced way, understanding the importance of the rules and the importance of what it means for those rules not simply to be breached, but to be shattered in the way that they are being here. Another thing to point out is that it's important not to take certain kinds of pretexts as really representing what the logic is of a state's actions. And an analogy, this is an analogy that's frequently abused, but I think it's one that's worth pondering. Many of you will probably be aware historically of the instance of the controversy over the Sudetenland in 1938, where the position taken by Nazi Germany was that these rather recently drawn borders imposed obviously by victors against vanquished in a recent war separated German-speaking people from one another, that the German majority in the borderland regions of Czechoslovakia should be seen as being able to realize their right of self-determination and their right to reunify with their German brethren, that their rights of self-determination were in various ways being undermined in Czechoslovakia, that German-speaking people were subject to various forms of discrimination. And these arguments got taken seriously in the late 1930s. And part of the reason for the capitulation of the West to Hitler at Munich in September 30th, 1938, was this sense that, well, after all, these norms about the use of force across borders are of recent vintage, that the borders themselves perhaps could be questioned. Borders, after all, exist only as a result of past uses of force. And people didn't really quite have the courage of their conviction with respect to these questions. What people, of course, failed to recognize was that the Sudetenland crisis had nothing to do with the Sudetenland. That this was pure pretext from the very beginning on the part of the German Reich, that the goal was, in fact, to disassemble Czechoslovakia's defensive capacities so as to leave Czechoslovakia open for invasion altogether, as was realized 6 months after Munich, when German forces unopposed came to take over Bohemia and Moravia. And so it's very important not to get caught up in the kinds of quibbling arguments that people might make about specific facts of the situation regarding Russian-speaking people in the Donbass or other parts of Ukraine, and other questions about whether this or that particular part of Ukrainian territory should have some other kind of status as some general question of some general matter of political morality. The reality of it is that this is an attack on Ukraine as such. It is a reflection of the refusal of the Russian Federation to acknowledge the sovereign equality of the states in what is referred to as the Russian near abroad, that is the states of the former Soviet Union. And so it's very important to recognize that this is extremely disturbing, extremely destabilizing across a wide front. And that this is a really critical moment in the history of the international system, and very much at stake is whether the international legal order as such can withstand this kind of challenge. Now, with respect to sort of the details, I'll just speak very quickly about the basic framework. The things that I really want to say are the meta issues that I've laid out. But just to give you some general sense of what the international law pertaining to these matters is, there are two basic bodies of international law pertaining to armed conflict. One has to do with recourse to force, or jus ad bellum, as we say in the trade, and the other having to do with the conduct of hostilities, or jus in bello, as we say. And so the law about the recourse to force is of much more recent vintage, interestingly. It is really a 20th century phenomenon. Prior to World War I, the basic idea was that states had the sovereign prerogative to use force across borders in their national interest, that there was something called the law of war and the law of peace, and states could, by declaring war, unilaterally change the terms of their international relations, and they could engage in war for the sake of territorial acquisition or conquest. And this is something that the international system arose in the 20th century to try to litigate and to mitigate and foreclose. First, with the effort in the League of Nations Covenant after World War I, backed up by something called the Kellogg-Briand Pact of Paris of 1928. This everyone remembers as a failed effort. But it was the first time that the use of force across borders other than in self-defense was made to be an explicit violation of existing international law. And of course, no sooner had the ink dried on the Kellogg-Briand Pact of Paris than Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931. Beginning a whole series of events where various powers engaged in uses of force across borders in violation of the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And there was, of course, in the course of the 1930s, a progressive collapse of that peace and security order. So it was only after World War II, with the United Nations Charter, that you really get a new international peace and security order founded upon the principle of the invalidity of the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity and political independence of states under Article 2, Paragraph 4 of the Charter, limited only by the right of self-defense, individual and collective, under Article 51, and then the special powers of the Security Council to act as the Security Council sees fit in the face of threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, or acts of aggression. The Security Council, of course, can only act when there is accord among the P5, the 5 permanent members out of the 15 members of the Security Council. There can be no vetoes among those 5. There can be abstentions, but you need 9 affirmative votes and no vetoes from the permanent 5 in order to have extraordinary authorizations for the use of force. However, you don't need extraordinary authorizations for the use of force in the case of self-defense against an armed attack. And here you have an armed attack on a sovereign state, and all states in the international system are licensed under Article 51 of the Charter to lend their support up to and including the use of force to protect the territorial integrity of Ukraine. So the fact that the Security Council is stymied in its actions at this point really is not a substantial impediment to the international law of self-defense with respect to coming to Ukraine's aid. There is, as I say, much that can be said about questions of self-determination and matters about minority rights within states. The important thing to recognize is that for reasons having to do with the basic logic of the international system, that whatever violations might be claimed about the rights of minority communities within states, this does not in any way license the use of force across borders. And even in the peculiar circumstances in which the issue has been cloudy, such as the question of the NATO intervention against Serbia in 1999 and the 78-day bombing campaign undertaken in order to drive Serbian forces out of Kosovo, which was part of sovereign Serbian territory, it's important to note there that there had been a long train of atrocities that had been perpetrated there by Serbian forces against the Kosovar Albanians that made this an arguable proposition, and still, in the view of most international legal scholars, an illegal act by NATO. But nonetheless, it had a certain legitimacy, arguably, with respect to fundamental principles in the international system, where there is this tension between sovereign inviolability of territory on the one hand and underlying concerns about the self-determination of political communities on the other. There is no plausible claim supporting the Russian position with respect to the Donbass or any other part of Ukraine that would be analogous to the Kosovar situation. This is simply intellectually dishonest on the part of people who are making that sort of claim. The other piece of international law that's relevant has to do with the use of force in regard to regulation of the conduct of hostilities. And the important thing to note here is that it's not simply a violation of international law in the sense of state responsibility to violate norms about the laws and customs of armed conflict. It is also an international crime to violate these things egregiously. And where civilians are targeted, or where there are indiscriminate attacks, or where there is collateral damage with respect to attacks on military targets that's clearly excessive with respect to the concrete military advantage to be gained by the attack, then the outcome is not simply that these are violations of international law giving rise to state responsibilities. They turn the perpetrators of these acts into enemies of humanity. And under the framework of the Geneva Conventions, there is a principle that states when they find people on their territory who have committed these acts, they are to be either prosecuted by those states or extradited to a state that will prosecute them. So these are attacks which are seen as outside the scope of any kind of legitimate war fighting, and we are seeing before our eyes many of these kinds of episodes taking place. More complicated questions about whether this could ever be dealt with in an international tribunal, but the fundamentals of international law are such that individual states are effectively deputized to carry out prosecutions with respect to these kinds of violations of jus in bello. The further question then is the question of the crime of aggression. This is frequently invoked. At Nuremberg, of course, people were prosecuted for crimes against peace. There was some question as to whether this was a valid international crime in 1945. There continues to be a question as to whether it's a valid international crime. Aggression is included within the statute of the International Criminal Court, but in a way that really makes it more hypothetical than real. And I would say at this point that there really isn't the mechanism in place to make it possible for people to be prosecuted even for an egregious violation of the international law regarding recourse to force. But we are in uncharted territory here in some respect, as in some ways we were in 1945. And so it remains to be seen how any of this might be treated going forward. Okay, well, that's all I have time for now, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting, and it spurred some questions in the chat room that hopefully we can address at the end of the session when we are doing question and answer. But before we get to that, I want to turn things over to our final speaker for the evening, Dr. Elisa Moldovanova.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm waiting for a second just for the PowerPoint slides to come up. But thank you so much for joining us today. And what I would like to contribute to this discussion and to this teaching is a slightly different perspective, the perspective that I'm most comfortable speaking about. And yet I think it's the kind of perspective that's important for us to understand how things got to this point and why we see a certain level of resistance within Ukrainian population that has been unthinkable or unexpected by many other international observers. So those of you who were able to join this teaching last week, you have heard about, the NATO perspective, the NATO side of things. You have talked about a geopolitical situation in Europe and how it plays out into this war and Russian Federation's invasion. And there was also a discussion of how we may begin to understand the position of Vladimir Putin and Russian Federation through this whole thing. So what I would like to contribute today is to focus on political and social transformations in Ukraine preceding the Russia's Federation invasion in 2022. And I think it is important for us to think about this for a variety of reasons. But one important argument that I would like today to make today by essentially reviewing the key milestones that Ukraine has gone through, starting from Orange Revolution, going through political reforms of 2004, 2010, and then the Euromaidan Revolution or the Revolution of Dignity, all the way through the Russia's Federation annexation of Crimea and intrusion to the east. The point of doing this review I would like to make is to showcase Ukraine as a democracy, as a country that could be called a democracy in the making. But nevertheless, this is the country that has established certain political institutions and has gone through both political and social transformations that explain where things are at and how things will potentially develop in the future. So first of all, I'd like to start from the Orange Revolution. So the Orange Revolution in Ukraine was a series of peaceful protests that happened in Ukrainian capital Kiev, as well as other major cities in Ukraine following the runoff vote in 2004 presidential election. So this is an important political event that was considered the major driver of democratic state building in Ukraine, and that at that point, Ukraine went all the way and took a different path that some of its neighbors, such as the Russian Federation or Belarus, were taking, which is why I think it's important for us to talk about that as a starting point of that whole conflict and as a starting point of the things that we see today. So the cause for the Orange Revolution was the runoff election, the second round that was contested between Viktor Yanukovych, the candidate in the president, and Viktor Yushchenko. And the picture that you see here is the portrayal of the Orange Revolution. So this was basically a series of the peaceful protests when people took off to the streets in the context of a massive evidence of fraud that was committed by the Central Election Authority and others during the second round of elections. And the goal was, of course, for people to display their dissatisfaction with basically the violation of the fair and free elections as the basic tenet of any democracy, if we can think of democracy in the first place. So how did we get there? In the first round of these elections, both Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko got over 39% of the popular vote. And according to the constitution in Ukraine, if a candidate gets more than 50% of the popular vote, then the election closes and that person is declared the victor. But in this case, because none of the candidates got at least a 50%, we end up in the situation when the second round of elections, runoff election, need to be run between Viktor Yanukovych and Viktor Yushchenko. So here I have just a couple of other actors that became influential and that actually point out to the fact how the democracy can be consolidated and how people representing a completely different platform. For example, here we have a Ukrainian head of the Ukrainian Socialist Party that basically allied themselves with others for the sake of preserving the right of people in Ukraine to exercise self-determination. And here you also see in the middle the picture of the previous president of Ukraine, Leonid Kuchma. And going back to my point about Ukraine as democracy, by the way, Leonid Kuchma is the only president in Ukraine that served more than one term. So that tells you right there how well Ukraine compares, for example, with Russian Federation, where the presidency of Mr. Putin doesn't seem to have an end, or how Ukraine compares with Belarus. So pretty much in Ukraine, if people are dissatisfied with certain policies or certain political regime, they're going to speak out and they're going to use the democratic means to remove a president or a political party from the power. So here's the map that displays the results of that election that spiked the controversy and that spiked the Orange Revolution. So what you see here is a very standard portrayal of the regional divisions and differences in Ukraine. And it will become important as you hear my talk, because I will show how over the course of time, those regional divisions lose their significance. Maybe not completely, but in principle, at that time, 2004, we have seen that there was very strong regional divisions between the eastern part of Ukraine and the western part of Ukraine. And even today, despite the fact that we no longer see those regional divisions on a multitude of different parameters, many political scientists as well as experts, propose the idea of dividing Ukraine into two. So as I go through this presentation, I hope you will see that what we saw in 2004 is no longer what we are seeing today. So we get to the second round of runoff election in 2004 presidential elections. And what we get is that Ukraine has independent and free media. Ukraine at that point has a growing and strong civil society actively engaged in the process of election monitoring and ensuring transparency from within. So all the evidence emerged that the results that the Central Election Commission is reporting are magnitudes different from what the observers are reporting and from the massive violations that are being registered with how the absentee ballots are used, the fraudulent elections in schools, prisons, and other public institutions. So this type of information becomes public, and expectedly so, people on both sides of the aisle, so to speak, using this American analogy, are outraged with the fact that it appears to be very clear that election has been stolen. So Yushchenko, at that point, the candidate and the president, calls for public to come out and protest. And what we have seen at that time is that both people who supported Viktor Yushchenko and who used the color of orange as a part of the political symbolism, as well as people who supported Viktor Yanukovych on the other side of the story, they all take to the streets, and not just in Kiev, but in the regions of Ukraine, because many of them are outraged with the information that has been exposed by the electoral fraud. And even people who wanted Viktor Yanukovych to win that election, they want him to win that election in a legal and, democratically acceptable way. So that's the first sign, unity, the sign of unity among the different parts of Ukrainian society, that regardless of the electoral outcomes, people came out and they were protesting and they were calling for the election runoff so that they can actually establish who is the real winner of those elections. So there was a lot of aspirations coming from within the Ukrainian society that become important at that time, including the idea of unity and together as a nation, Ukraine is strong regardless of the regional, language, or other types of divisions. This was also a time when the aspirations for democracy, peace, and freedom become mainstream, and it was also the time when Ukrainians start looking closer to the European Union and European aspirations, essentially aspiring to become a democratic and a lawful state. So Orange Revolution ends up being a success, and there are two reasons why it has become a success. Not only it was peaceful, but it also produced substantial political change. So the first set of factors that were at play was the human factors. So unity in scale. Hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians from east to west all went to support the free and fair election. From all sectors of society, all generations, people who represent professional occupations, governmental officials, people who come from rural communities, there was a lot of unity around the ideas that pushed the Orange Revolution to happen. And of course, many people had very similar aspirations at the time. And I was one of the people who joined the Orange Revolution, and what followed is my transition from the civil society sector into the government of Ukraine at that time. So I was the eyewitness of what was going on at that time in Ukraine. But of course, outside support, much like today, was very important for Ukraine. As a democracy in the making, this is a very different story from a democratic country that has centuries of tradition, right? So it was very important that countries such as Poland and Georgia supported Ukraine, as well as Western Europe and United States supported Ukraine. Another factor that explains the success of this transformation was the institutional factors. So what we have seen is the unification of opposition. So as I said, people on the variety of political spectra, including the socialists, the liberals, the conservatives, they came together, not for the specific outcome, but because they were also outraged that the governmental agencies were used to push a certain outcome. The other thing that we have seen at that time, and which is something that's happening today, is that Ukrainian oligarchs, so basically the power and the wealth holders and the economic elites, likewise come out and support this as a peaceful protest, and essentially as something that opens the room to strengthen democracy in Ukraine. Another important point here was the position of the security forces in Ukraine, that at that time pretty much took a peacekeeping mission to make sure that the protests are peaceful, and that they promised, the security forces have promised to people who were in the streets that we're not going to use force against you. We're here to keep peace. Other agencies, non-governmental organizations, media, and international networks have pretty much all supported the transformation. So as a result, Orange Revolution has resulted in a peaceful resolution and a democratic resolution of the crisis. We're using the democratic means means, such as a decision of the Supreme Court, it was decided that it was impossible to establish election results due to the massive fraud. As a result of the political compromise made between the major political parties involved in resolving this in a democratic way was a set of certain changes to the Ukrainian constitution and the re-vote in the runoff election that led to Viktor Yushchenko being elected with 51% of the popular vote. So in terms of the institutional changes that took place in Ukraine, constitutional changes in 2004, this could basically be described as the shift from the semi-presidential form of government towards the parliamentary form of government, which means that now the parliament gets certain powers that it didn't have, and the presidential powers are reduced, and now the president and the parliament have to engage in what we know here today as the checks and balances type of system. And the other thing that happened is that Ukrainian government has transitioned to a coalition form of government, largely because of the push by a socialist, Alexander Moroz at the time, who was trying to model this using several European democracy models. But basically the thing is that it's no longer the majority of the parliament that's responsible for forming the cabinet of ministers that will carry out a political and policy reform, but rather multiple parties which are elected to the parliament need to form a coalition and come together to define Ukrainian policy agenda. One other change that happened is the creation of the closed list proportional parliamentary election system. And it was important in Ukraine because, as many of you know, many political parties in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe and in Central Europe are quite unstable. So at that time, it was critically important to strengthen political parties as institutions, and giving the rights to political parties to assemble their own electoral lists was an important institution that was used to strengthen political parties and bring greater stability to the political life. So at that time, there was very important hopes and expectations in terms of the reform that Ukraine was supposed to see during the tenure of Viktor Yushchenko as the president of Ukraine, which includes the advancement of political rights and civil liberties, a more formal commitment of moving towards a European Union and closer to Europe, free market reforms, a variety of reforms in all of the sectors of governmental policy, reducing corruptions, prosecuting political crimes, among other ideas. So what happens is that Yushchenko stays in power for one term, and there are both achievements and problems that his presidency has carried out. So his major achievements included the advancement of political rights and liberties, and Ukraine is still capitalizing on some of these advances. The restoration of the historical truths, and the Ukraine at that time also joined the World Trade Organization, which was extremely important, and I actually played a bit of a role in supporting the joining of Ukraine to WTO in 2008. So this was an important move because it basically showed the commitment of Ukraine of being integrated with European economic institutions, and the commitment to play by basically, the free market types of games, rules of the game. Unfortunately, however, there were some problems as well. So the governmental reform has largely stalled for a variety of reasons, and the attempts to reduce corruption have been only partially successful, and the same applies to attempts to investigate political crimes. And finally, NATO rejects the membership accession plan from both Ukraine and Georgia, leading to Russia's invasion, by the way, in Georgia. But that's what happened at that time. So it was a significant pushback. So as a result, closer to the end of his term in the office, the acting president of Ukraine loses the popular support. And in the elections of 2010, he now gets less than 6% of the popular vote. On the other hand, one of his major allies, Yulia Tymoshenko, comes up as a contender in these elections, alongside with Viktor Yanukovych, who comes up as an important player. But what becomes important to the argument that I'm trying to make today is this map, right? So this is the map of the voting patterns in 2010. 2010. You can see that the map is quite different from the map that I showed to you in 2004, meaning that now we can see much more mixing in terms of the support for one or the other candidate. And we can also see that the regional divide maybe is somewhat still there, but not to the same degree, which basically tells you that people were able to consolidate their preferences based on political, economic, and other types of substantive issues, as opposed to the simple divide of Ukraine between East and West, which is, you know, East is closer to Russian Federation and West is closer to Western Europe. So what happens in these elections is that Viktor Yanukovych prevails, and the first thing that he does, he tries to scale back the political institutional reform. And he basically attempts to reinstate the constitution in Ukraine that existed in 1996, which means that he increases the presidential powers, he shifts away some of the functions that were previously performed by the parliament back to the president. And he also dismantles or steps away from the coalition form of government, promoting the majority form of government, where the party that gets the most votes in the parliament would be the party that decides most of the policy agendas and political appointments. It was also the time when Viktor Yanukovych went after his political opponents, going as far as to put Yulia Tymoshenko in prison, once again causing huge outcry and a series of smaller but yet massive protests from the citizens of Ukraine. And this happens to other people who were part of Yushchenko's team, not just Yulia Tymoshenko, but her case is one of the most resonant cases. Among other things that Yanukovych has changed includes also changes in the election law. So just as an example, the electoral threshold at that time to the parliament was raised from 3% to 5%. And that basically means that smaller parties are not going to make it to the parliament. So it's going to make it easier to control the parliament, right? So this was exactly the story of the Ukrainian Socialist Party that didn't make the 5% threshold. So Ukrainian socialists got wiped out from the map at that time. There were other changes that were happening outside of the election law. For example, attempts to restrict independent media and control media content. So kind of taking more of a Russia example type. And there was also several landmark pieces of legislation that went into effect, including the so-called criminalization of slander law that was supposed to limit freedom of speech, as well as the adoption of the landmark language law that granted the rights to local governments to create more than one official language if there is at least 10% of population in the region who uses that language actively. So that's how we arrived to the parliamentary elections in 2012. And these are the results of those parliamentary elections. So expectedly so, the party of the ruling president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, now gets 30% of the votes. And because now we are in the majoritarian form of government, his party gets control over basically major policy appointments, right? Because the constitution was reversed. And what we have now is basically the dominance of the one-party politics, the party of regions, in this case, the party of the ruling president. We also have high concentration of presidential parliament, and we have a divided parliament. So this was basically what happened in the institutional level. But also this is the time when the world is hit with the Great Recession, and Ukraine, going through these political transformations, experiences substantial challenges in coping with the consequences of economic recession. So the popular dissatisfaction with the government grows. And what also happens, because now the presidential party controls the appointment process for all of the policy areas, as well as the prime minister, Viktor Yanukovych has pretty much brought all of these ghosts of the previous regime back and placed them into key positions, from the Ministry of Tax to the Ministry of Defense. All of these people that nobody was hoping will ever see again, now they're in charge of the governmental policy again. So this was a very dark time in Ukraine. But what leads to the next important political event and the crisis of 2014 is the dispute around around the EU neighborhood policy. So there was a larger understanding within the Ukrainian society, whether these were supporters of Viktor Yanukovych. Significant portions of them likewise supported EU neighborhood policy and the inclusion of Ukraine into the discussions about expansion of European Union. But in 2012, European Union signs a deal with Ukraine on free trade and political association, which is basically the next step that a country needs to take to be considered as a full member of the European Union. The deal, however, is conditioned upon Ukraine's ability to proceed with the democratic changes and electoral changes, as well as the commitment to release political opponents. So the parliamentary majority rejects the law to release political opponents and pretty much stalls this process of moving Ukraine towards the EU. And then later that same month in November, Viktor Yanukovych attends EU summit in Vilnius, and under pressure from the Russian Federation's president, he does not sign the association agreement, despite what was the expectation of him to start with. And he sort of unilaterally, or with a very small group of allies, chooses to develop closer economic ties with Russia. So what unfolds is a wave of ongoing peaceful demonstrations and protests, where people essentially are united with the goal to protest against what Yanukovych and his party in the parliament have done to set Ukraine back on the path of the European integration. So you can see that, you know, there is a lot of symbolism, there is a lot of colors of different flags. And of course, the dominant idea was that Ukraine is a European country and Ukraine has chosen a path towards democracy. And what also happens is that the agenda evolves. So people start bringing up the ideas that are important in terms of the policy reform, such as we need to fight corruption, we need to reform governmental institutions, we need to fight against consolidating of power in one hand and things like that. So the agenda of the Euromaidan evolves, but the position that the government at that time took was very different from the position that the acting government and acting president took during the Orange Revolution. Specifically, the parliamentary majority pushes a number of restrictions on civil liberties, trying to limit people's ability to voice peacefully their protests. And government also orders the clashes with police on Euromaidan, and then there is a sniper's attack happening that kills 100 people. It is to this day undetermined who exactly ordered the sniper's attack, but it was very clear that the government in action took efforts to not pursue this as a peaceful agenda. So then what happens? How is this resolved? So what happens is that Viktor Yanukovych and several of his allies flee the country. So they just quit. They flee the country and they go to Russia. And the remaining members of the parliament, once again, speaking of Ukraine's kind of democracy in making argument that I'm making here, they use the democratic process to impeach him as a president of Ukraine, as a parliament, and then they call for early presidential elections. They also, as a parliament, as representatives, elected representatives of the people of Ukraine, appoint temporary government, and they vote for legislation that cancels some of this barbaric laws restricting civil liberties, and they nullify some of the legislation that was passed during Yanukovych administration to go back to the model of more balanced powers. But what is also happening at this time is the worsening of economic situation in Ukraine and the beginning of the Crimean crisis and invasion by the Russian Federation. So the invasion by the Russian Federation starts from your regular portfolio, military drills, right? And then denying the fact that there are Russian soldiers who are now present in Crimea and who are now trying to seize the buildings in the Crimean capital of Simferopol. So for a long time, Russian government and Russian president denied that these were actually Russian soldiers who were staging, the so-called referendum in Crimea, in which people of Crimea supposedly voted for independence from Ukraine. So Crimea was semi-independent from Ukraine. It was an semi-autonomous republic, but this took it to the next level, voting for complete independence and incorporation as part of Russia. And although at that time, Russian President Vladimir Putin requested the authorization from Russian parliament to use the force in Ukraine, for a long time he denied that these were Ukrainian soldiers holding the guns, in Crimea, but that basically was recognized following these events. So what happens next is somewhat a similar situation, and Donetsk and so-called Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic declare their independence from Ukraine. And what we see is the demonstrations by so-called pro-Russian groups in Donbass that escalate into an armed conflict. What we also see is the evidence from NATO and other international organizations. So for Russian military forces and Russian soldiers, sometimes covered, sometimes uncovered, sending basically their troops into the territory of Ukraine to back up those so-called Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. So the conflict did not end in the east. There was some sporadic clashes and bomb explosions in other regions of Ukraine, for example, in Odessa, in Kherson, and in Kharkiv, but things have not gone anywhere in those other parts of Ukraine. So this only now limits to Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. So that's how we get to the urgent presidential election of 2014. So the urgent presidential election happens in all of this context, right? So there is a presence of Russian military in Crimea, and there is now an ongoing military conflict with the involvement of Russian forces in the east of Ukraine. And it is at that time that we once again see the evidence of consolidation from all of the parts of Ukrainian society and from all of the regions of Ukraine. And the reason is, I'm saying this, is that Petro Poroshenko wins the popular vote with over 54% of votes in the first round of elections. So Ukraine usually has at least 2 rounds of elections, but this is an urgent situation and everybody realizes that this has to stop. So people come together and they support this candidate so they can have a legitimate president and they can have a legitimate government. So what happens next is the term of Petro Poroshenko as a president. So he has attempted to pursue some of the democratic reform, and he has attempted to engage in a variety of policy changes to support the democratic aspirations of Ukrainians. He is trying to tackle the economic crisis, but he has seen a lot of the lack of success in this regard, in part because there is a military invasion going on in the east of Ukraine, and there is a situation in Crimea. So you can see that it becomes extremely difficult, even with such a strong support from the majority of the population, to put any kind of reform. And of course, the largest expectation from Petro Poroshenko would be that he will stop the war. So he tries to conduct some negotiations and ceasefire agreement with Vladimir Putin, and Vladimir Putin participates in these negotiations while still denying the involvement of Russia. And then the most important piece of legislation, or no, it's not even a legislation, the most important piece of agreement that was passed in February 2015 was the so-called Minsk agreement that was signed by Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics and Ukrainian government to stop the conflict. And the provision was that these territories will integrate back in Ukraine in exchange for greater autonomy. But this agreement was never implemented. And that's how we get to 2019. So in 2019, Petro Poroshenko, of course, loses the election because he's unable to stop the war. And in the situation that existed at the time, it was also unthinkable for him to push any comprehensive reform agenda. And that's how current president of Ukraine, Vladimir Zelensky, comes into place. And what you see in this map is even more drastic than the story that I told you through the previous maps. What you see here is the high degree of consolidation of Ukrainian society all over the place, with the exception of one region of Ukraine and those Ukrainians who are abroad, so those are Ukrainians who are voting outside of Ukraine. So Volodymyr Zelensky wins 73% of the popular vote. He's seen as a new face. So this was part of why he was elected, because he doesn't have the Soviet connections and Soviet heritage as much as the other former contenders did. But he is also seen as a peace president. So the president who campaigned on restoring the peace. And that same year, the parliamentary election happens, which likewise gives the majority of the seats in the parliament to his political party. So Volodymyr Zelensky campaigned on the platform of peace appeal, and people had very high hopes. And it was interesting that his appeal was for the peace, but not the kind of peace that denies Ukrainian territorial integrity. He was famous to have joked at that time that the border is the only thing that Russia and Ukraine have in common. And that pretty much describes his position, right? So he's a Russian-speaking pro-Ukrainian president who wants unity and who wants peace. So now we are ending up in an 8-year war with over 14,000 people killed and 1.5 million displaced from Ukraine, which includes both Crimea and the eastern regions of Ukraine. So the situation is that we have now today is in some ways are familiar for Ukraine and Ukrainians, because it has already been an ongoing 8-year war that has just been escalated now. And what we have seen from the President Zelensky's agenda is some of his agenda items have been implemented more successfully than others. He has managed to bring the fresh face to the government, but there was also concerns about the professionalism and capacity of his cabinet to implement meaningful change. And of course, he was unable to stop the war. So as a result, in October 2021, his approval rating drops to 28%. So today, actually, because he has displayed his position and he has acted as a leader for Ukraine, as well as the leader who was able to consolidate, many countries in the world, his approval rating goes to 90%. So I'd like to just finish this by highlighting some of the immediate effects on Ukrainian political system and society that this war or this escalation has had so far. So from society to political parties, Ukraine so far has seen an enormous political and social unity. The regional divisions have become secondary. The question of national identity is stronger today in Ukraine than it has ever been in the recent memory. The question of language that was used as a political manipulation is not only an issue today, but it's kind of playing out in an opposite direction, that many people who prefer to speak Russian now, want to do nothing with Russian language or Russian culture, which is, I think a complete demise of the goals that Russian Federation had for this war. And finally, the attitudes towards Russian people are also collapsing from this brotherly attitude that many people in Ukraine had to nothing like that attitude ever again. And the attitude towards the West becomes sort of a wait and see type of situation, where Ukrainians very much appreciate the support that United States, Poland, countries of European Union, and other countries in the world, Turkey and others, have provided to them. But they're also very careful about, waiting and seeing of whether more support will be provided to Ukraine. Because I think most Ukrainians understand today that Ukraine will resist till the end, but Ukraine is unable to win on its own. Ukraine needs support and Ukraine needs consolidation.
Thank you so much. That was extremely informative, and I think for many of us, Ukraine and particularly its internal politics is sort of a blank slate we don't know much about, and so it's easy to talk about Ukraine as an entity without really knowing very much about what it is that we're talking about. So I think your presentation really helped fill in a lot of those blanks. I do want to, since we have about 10 minutes for questions here, turn to some of the questions that have been popping up in the chat room, and quite a few of them have to do with international law. So I might try to bundle a couple of those together, since I think a few of them are maybe a little bit more in depth and a few might be a bit easier to address. So one of the first ones, and I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but what kind of, Brad, you said that the situation that's playing out now from the perspective of international law really sort of almost blows apart some of the international legal norms that have been in place since World War II. And somebody asked, what distinguishes this case from other conflicts like the situation in Palestine or the U.S. invasion of Iraq, which also could be seen in that light. Somebody also asked, under international law, how could Putin realistically be tried for anything, given the fact that Russia doesn't recognize the International Criminal Court and they have nuclear weapons? And then somebody asked whether Ukraine's martial law that prevents men from leaving violates the International Declaration of Human Rights, Article 12.2. So I'll kind of put those out for anyone, but I think they were mainly intended for you.
Okay, well, let me work backwards. The first one is an interesting question about the ability of men to leave the country. The international law on this, I am not sure whether it could be said to be completely settled. The problem is that the right exists, so the rights in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights are all bundled in a way that are qualified in Article 29 by other considerations, and there's always a balancing question. The Universal Declaration is not a treaty, it's not legally binding, it's a statement of principles. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights codified this, and Article 12 goes to this question, but Article 12 is filled with qualifications, including a national security qualification, and there's no authoritative interpretation that really could nail down the question of whether in these unusual circumstances this would be a violation. Keeping in mind, of course, that conscription is generally speaking understood to withstand other kinds of human rights with respect to people's freedoms under the ICCPR. There are other kinds of violations, though, that clearly are being carried out by Ukrainian forces. It's very important to understand that there are no wars without war crimes. There are no situations of armed conflict where there are not various kinds of violations. One sort of violation that we've seen is where prisoners of war have been paraded in front of the press. That is a violation. It's not necessarily a criminal violation of the law of armed conflict, but it is a violation with respect to the state responsibility of Ukraine. You can think what you will about that and whether that should be something to be highlighted or whether it is something that pales by comparison in the overall evaluation of the circumstance. With respect to trials, as a practical matter, states are unlikely to engage in universal jurisdiction prosecutions of individuals who are from influential states, particularly when those states' governments are still in power. Sometimes, of course, those governments end up passing from the scene, and individuals who were working under those governments find themselves hung out to dry. That's how most people end up getting prosecuted in foreign jurisdictions under international law. And that is the most likely scenario in these circumstances, but it's sort of putting the cart before the horse to think about trials before we see other kinds of resolution and perhaps transformations of the politics within the Russian Federation itself. The ICC could have jurisdiction over these matters because Ukraine, even though not a party to the ICC, can confer jurisdiction over a particular controversy in their territory. It can only do so if it also accepts that its own people can be subject to prosecution in the ICC. Whether anything will happen, the ICC moves very, very slowly. It is the most overrated institution in the world, as far as I'm concerned, in international legal terms. But it's not. One can't totally exclude the possibility. I would exclude the possibility of prosecutions for aggression before the ICC because that mechanism is far too underdeveloped to make it possible. With respect to other kinds of instances, no, I am totally the wrong person to give a defense either of the denials of the self-determination rights of the Palestinian people on the one hand, or of the invasion of Iraq on the other. I have been extraordinarily critical of both of those things. I think, though, that it's important not to be yielding to a kind of whataboutism in respect to these matters. And there are plausible arguments that were at least sort of within the scope of a certain set of expectations with respect to these matters. And I'm saying this as someone who thought that both of the invasion of Iraq was legally outrageous, and also that there are very significant violations over a long period of time of the self-determination rights and other rights of the Palestinian people by the Israelis. Still in all, the Iraqi regime, the most important thing to say about the Iraqi regime is the incredible violence that had been perpetrated within its national territory, and the number of people around the world from different perspectives who sort of through the embrace of various kinds of principles that are acknowledged by international law, thought that an exceptional action should be taken against Iraq. I think they were wrong about that at the time. They've been proved more wrong subsequently, I think, but still it's a different situation. People had not been subjected to that sort of predation within the borders of Ukraine, and so it's something of a red herring as an example of a kind of equivalency. Similarly, with respect to Israel-Palestine, important to recognize that there are existential issues of Israelis with respect to these questions. None of that, in my view, justifies measures that have been taken by Israel over a long period of time. And we could go on at great length about all of the ways in which the rights of Palestinians under international law and otherwise have been violated by Israel. But I, again, don't see that as being a kind of attack on the international legal order as such, as we've seen in this particular instance, where the fundamental territorial integrity of a state, territorial inviolability of a sovereign entity in the international system has been, in a really thoroughly unprovoked manner, breached in the most dramatic sort of way. And so I do think that we have to keep these matters in that kind of perspective.
Thank you. And then we have time for one more question, and it's been sort of chatted about a little bit in the chat room, but I think perhaps Dr. Moldovanova might be able to offer some insight on why the Minsk Accords were never fully implemented, as you indicated in your talk.
I can just give a quick response, which akin to the joke that I made in the chat when Brad was talking about the game of chess. So if you lose a game of chess, if you're a normal opponent, you just say, well, I lost. But, if you're Russian Federation, you take the board and you smash your neighbor with the board, right? You can still win the game. So what I'm getting at is, there was no will to implement those agreements, meaning that, okay, Ukraine can uphold its part of the bargain, but what is the interest of Russia, as we now see in retrospect, to actually follow through on those agreements? Even now, just looking at how their military campaign supposedly evolves, we can see that they're not interested in the parts of these regions. They want to take more of Ukrainian territory, and they want to exclude Ukraine forever from any, alliance. And to that end, it doesn't matter if Ukraine would have agreed to this Minsk agreement and followed through. They have found a way to violate those agreements because it doesn't match the goals that they have. So I think that's the reason why they were not followed through, because now we are seeing a glimpse of the goals that Russian Federation has.
Thank you. Yeah, that's really helpful to know. So that's right. We're right at 7:30 now. So I think it's time to bring things to a close. I want to thank all of our presenters for their extremely erudite talks today. I learned a lot, and I certainly hope that all of the audience who is in participation also learned a lot. I want to thank the audience for showing up. And please do keep an eye on your emails. You all RSVP'd, which means you gave me your email address, and I will be emailing you a link to the video of this so that you can see it later. If you choose. I know there were a couple of people in the chat who said they want to show it to their students and stuff, and that will be happening very soon. So thank you all. Please make sure you RSVP for next week, and we'll see you at the same time in the same place for another talk.